In this lab, we'll take a look at the body cavities. So our bodies are not all solid. We actually have these hollow areas known as body cavities. They actually provide protection for us. Our organs can move, things like the lungs can expand and contract, the heart can move, the intestines, and they also contain linings which prevent friction. Because as we know, is when things move or rub up against one another, it produces friction, which produces heat. That wouldn't be good. That would be that would could cause damage to the tissues. So we're going to divide the body cavities into two parts. The first part is the dorsal or the posterior body cavity. That would include the cranial cavity and the vertebral column. So here's a picture just of a sagittal view in this gentleman here. So the brain would be up in here. This would be the cranial cavity, and then the brain would come down and form the spinal cord, and all in here where my cursor is running, this would be the vertebral cavity. And so the cranial cavity is formed by the 8 skull bones. Obviously, that's going to contain the brain. And then the vertebral cavity is formed by the vertebrae, and that's going to house the spinal cord. We're going to get into the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity later in the semester. Our focus for this lab is going to be on the ventral or the anterior body cavity. If I go to this picture here, we can see all of this is the anterior body cavity or ventral. Again, anterior means in the front. This structure right here is a dome muscle known as the diaphragm. So we're going to see above the diaphragm, everything in here is the thoracic cavity, and then everything down over here is known as the abdominopelvic cavity. Let's go back to the note. So again, the anterior or the ventral body cavity is divided by an important muscle. I want you to know the muscle. It's the diaphragm. And again, the cavity now above the diaphragm is known as the thoracic cavity. The cavity below is the abdominopelvic cavity. So this here is the orange torso. What I like about this has actually been, all the organs have been taken out. So there's no organs in the thoracic, there's no organs in the abdominopelvic. And then what I did is I just drew a yellow highlighter across here to show you this is about where the diaphragm would be. And so our diaphragm would be about over here, maybe a little bit higher, just about like that. And then this is actually a picture of a model of the diaphragm. So this would fit right in here. Everything above would be the thoracic cavity. Everything below the yellow line where the diaphragm would fit is the abdominopelvic cavity. So before I get into breaking down the cavities a little bit more, I want to just let you know that the anterior body cavity has these serous membranes. This is a membrane that produces actually a thin, slippery fluid, and we see these serous membranes on these body cavities. They actually line the cavity wall as well as covering the organ. The job of this lining is to produce, again, this thin, slippery fluid called serous fluid, which is going to reduce the friction. So as our hearts beat and the heart is moving in that cavity, the fluid reduces the friction. As we breathe in and out, the lungs are lined by this lining, and it's going to reduce the friction. Now, when the lining lines the cavity wall, we call it the parietal layer. If you remember from part 1 of this lab, parietal always means a wall, a cavity wall. The same lining, right, the same serous membrane that covers the organ is known as the visceral layer. Right? So whenever you hear parietal, just think of the cavity wall. Whenever you hear visceral, think of the organ that's in that cavity. So here's a picture just to kind of give you that concept of the heart, and the heart would be in a cavity we're going to call the pericardial cavity. This kind of reddish line right here, this represents that serous membrane that I had mentioned before. So the serous membrane on the heart right here, all of this would be the visceral serous membrane. Then this lining here would be up against the cavity wall. The cavity wall would be out over here. So the same lining, it's no different, is called the parietal pericardium. A great way to do an analogy is this, is to take a balloon, push your fist into the balloon. So now your fist would be the organ, let's say the heart. The balloon that's touching you would be the visceral serous membrane. Then over here, the balloon that would be up against the cavity wall would be the parietal. The space between the two membranes is where the fluid would flow, and that would reduce the friction. So we can divide the thoracic cavity into more cavities. The thoracic cavity, we just said before, is surrounded by the chest wall, and below it would be the diaphragm. But now we're going to divide it up. In the middle of the thoracic cavity is a midline structure known as the mediastinum. It's like a midline wall, and that's going to divide the thoracic cavity into two smaller cavities on the sides known as the pleural cavities. Right, so by putting this midline structure there, we're going to divide the big thoracic cavity into two smaller pleural cavities. The thing I need you to know about the pleural cavities is they house the left and the right lungs. So let's just take a picture real quick. Here's a good kind of flow chart way of looking at this, where the whole orange out here represents the anterior body cavity. And we have the functions here. Now, the thoracic cavity would be above the diaphragm, and the abdominopelvic cavity is below the diaphragm. So let's take a look at this thoracic cavity now. So if we put this midline structure in the thoracic cavity right here, this would be the mediastinum. On the right side of the mediastinum, where the right lung would be, this is known as the right pleural cavity. And then over here on the left side would be the left pleural cavity, and this is where the left lung would be. Right, so all we're saying is this midline wall is forming a cavity over here as well as a cavity over here. Those two cavities are known as the pleural cavities, and they contain the lungs. So as we mentioned before, each cavity is lined by the serous membrane. The name of the serous membrane in the pleural cavity is known as the pleura. Just give this a little bit of a highlight. This is the serous membrane. It has the same name as the pleural cavity, so it's easy to remember. The pleura on the lung would be known as the visceral pleura, and the pleura that lines the cavity wall would be the parietal pleura. Right, so both are the same type of membrane, and both of them produce that thin, slippery fluid. And so here's actually a sagittal view of the thoracic cavity, but now we've divided it where here's the pleural cavity. Let's go back to the mediastinum for a minute. So we said a second ago the mediastinum is the midline wall that divides the thoracic cavity so that there's a right and left pleural cavity. If we were to look at the mediastinum more closely, we would see that the upper part of the mediastinum contains some large blood vessels. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of the aorta, the superior vena cava, right? Those are really large blood vessels. They're in the upper part of the mediastinum. The trachea is the windpipe. The esophagus is the food tube, and a gland that's important in our immunity is known as the thymus. That would be in there also. All of those structures are in the upper part of the mediastinum. The lower part of the mediastinum has another cavity. This is going to be the third cavity in the thoracic cavity. This is where the heart is located. So you're going to know this as the pericardial cavity. And if you look down over here, the pericardial cavity is going to be where the heart goes. Let's go back to the flow chart for a minute. So just to review, all of this in here in blue is the thoracic cavity. Everything in here is the thoracic cavity. The midline wall is the mediastinum. To the right of the midline wall is the right pleural cavity, contains the right lung. To the left of the mediastinum, left pleural cavity contains the left lung. Here we have the upper part of the mediastinum contains structures. So like I mentioned before, the trachea, the esophagus, some major blood vessels like the aorta, superior vena cava, the thymus we had mentioned. All of that is in the upper part of the mediastinum, but the lower part of the mediastinum has another cavity. This is the cavity that surrounds the heart and contains the heart, known as the pericardial cavity. So we see here this thoracic cavity is actually divided into three smaller cavities: the right and left pleural cavities and the pericardial cavity. So same as the pleural cavities that had a serous membrane, the pericardial cavity also has a serous membrane. And if you can just highlight here, that serous membrane is known as the pericardium. So it's easy. The pericardium has the same name as the cavity. Makes it simple to remember. The pericardium on the heart, again, since the heart is an organ, is called the visceral pericardium. The pericardium on the wall of the pericardial cavity is called the parietal, again, because parietal means wall. So here's the pink torso model that we use in class. If we take a look here, this is a frontal section. So this domed muscle right here, and we can see part of it down over here. The front part was cut away, but this dome muscle is the diaphragm. Now, this is representing the left lung. This is in the left pleural cavity. Here's the right lung. This would be in the right pleural cavity. This one is cut. That's why it looks a little bit different than the left lung. Then all of this from here over, everything in here, everything in the middle, this is the this is the mediastinum. So all the stuff in the top part of the mediastinum are going to be the blood vessels we had mentioned. Right here happens to be the aorta. This is red blood vessel. This is the superior vena cava. This tube right here is the trachea, and right behind it is the esophagus. So all of those structures are in the upper part of the mediastinum. But look at this. This cavity down over here, it's empty right now, but this would contain the heart. This would be the pericardial cavity. Okay, so left lung in the left pleural cavity, right lung in the right pleural cavity, heart in the pericardial cavity. This is another model, the large muscle, male muscle model. Left lung in the left pleural cavity. Now the right lung here is empty, so this yellow lining right here would actually be the parietal pleura. Here's the mediastinum in the middle, aorta, superior vena cava. Right there is the trachea. This is the food tube, the esophagus, and then this cavity right over here is where the heart would sit. This is the pericardial cavity, and again, this would be the diaphragm right over here. Always a dome muscle, pretty much right in the middle of the anterior body cavity. So that was the more difficult part. The rest is pretty easy. The abdominopelvic cavity was, we had said before, the cavity below the diaphragm. Watch this. Sometimes the abdominal cavity and the upper part of the pelvic cavity is known as the peritoneal cavity. The abdominal cavity contains primarily the digestive organs and some of our glands. The pelvic cavity down below contains the urinary bladder in both sexes. The reproductive organs would be like the uterus and the ovaries, the prostate gland, that type of thing. And then the lower part of the digestive tract in both sexes. Let's take a look over here. So we had done the blue before. Now we're looking at the cavity below the diaphragm. On this diagram here, this is known as this is going to be painted in kind of a purplish. So this is the abdominopelvic cavity. And like I mentioned before, the peritoneal cavity, if you want to call it that, extends throughout the abdominal cavity and into the upper part of the pelvic cavity. Right, it doesn't go all the way down to the pelvic cavity. Like I mentioned before, the abdominal cavity is mostly going to be our digestive organs and glands, and then the pelvic cavity contains the bladder, the reproductive organs, and the lower portion of the digestive system. So if we look at this gentleman here from the diaphragm all the way down, this is the abdominopelvic cavity, would be the whole thing. But the light blue part, all of this, all the way down to the upper part of the pelvic cavity, that would be the peritoneal cavity, right? That would be the peritoneal cavity. So if we look over here, here's the diaphragm, and the whole thing would be abdominopelvic, all the way down to here. The peritoneal cavity would include maybe from here up. All right, so it's kind of like a subdivision of the entire abdominopelvic cavity. And here's on the other male muscle model, diaphragm. Then from here all the way down, this is the abdominopelvic cavity. Let's go back to the note. So this cavity also contains a serous membrane. That serous membrane is known as the peritoneum. So that's the lining that's going to produce the thin, slippery fluid. Again, the lining on the organs is known as the visceral peritoneum. The lining on the abdominopelvic wall is the parietal peritoneum. Just on a clinical note, the three linings, the pleura, the pericardium, and the peritoneum, sometimes they become inflamed and cause severe pain. It can even be life-threatening situations. So individuals that are going to be working in the emergency department, they deal with this almost on a daily basis where the patients come into the hospital with inflammation. If it was an inflammation of the peritoneum, it would be called peritonitis. Right? We sometimes see that when somebody has an appendicitis, they have an ectopic pregnancy, they have pelvic inflammatory disease. If it inflamed the pericardium, it would be a pericarditis. And if it inflamed the pleura, they would call it a pleuritis. So these are important anatomical structures because they do have clinical relevance. So that ends our section on the body cavities.